My name is Emily Thompson. I'm 36 years old, and until last week, I thought my greatest professional challenge was designing a perfect home for a client I knew I'd never live in. Then a single envelope arrived in the mail, a piece of paper informing me that my lake house, my sanctuary, my one and only personal investment had been sold without my knowledge. The sellers? My own parents. They did it to bail out their golden child, my brother, from yet another catastrophic business failure. They felt entitled to it, that my sacrifice was a foregone conclusion. What they never expected, not in a million years, was that for the last 5 years, I had secretly been the owner of the very mansion they were living in. If you're watching this from somewhere, drop a comment and let me know where you're from. Before I tell you this story of betrayal and ultimate justice, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life stories about family boundaries and reclaiming your power. Stories that just might change how you see your own relationships. Before that fateful Tuesday, my life was a carefully constructed blueprint of deadlines and designs. As an architect, I found my purpose in creating spaces for others' homes, where families would build memories, offices where ideas would come to life. I had worked tirelessly since graduation, building my reputation one project at a time. I wasn't wealthy by my family's standards, but I was stable, comfortable, and most importantly, independent. That independence was everything to me, because growing up in my family, it felt like the rarest of luxuries. My parents, Robert and Carol, were people who perpetually lived beyond their means. They adored the aesthetics of success, but lacked the discipline to sustain it. My father was a financial consultant who had taken an early retirement after a couple of lucky stock market wins, and my mother had never truly held a job in her life, her primary occupation being the careful curation of their social standing. They resided in a sprawling mansion in a wealthy suburb, a home that always felt a little too cavernous, decorated with expensive objects bought on credit. It was a stage set for a life they couldn't truly afford. And then there was my brother Mark. 4 years my junior, Mark was the son in my parents' universe. He was the golden child, incapable of doing any wrong. While I was working 2 summer jobs to save up for my first used car, a beat-up sedan that smelled faintly of rust, my parents bought Mark a brand new sports car for his 16th birthday. When I was navigating the complex world of scholarships and student loans for architecture school, they quietly drained my college fund, a fund I had contributed to with my own part-time earnings to finance Mark's inspirational gap year across Europe, which consisted mostly of partying and skiing. "Mark needs to find his creative spark, Emily," my mother had said dismissively when I found out. "You already have a solid plan." My solid plan was code for being the responsible one, the family backstop. Another time, I remember saving for months for a professional drafting table after I graduated. It was a significant purchase, a symbol of my new career. The week I was going to buy it, my mother called in a panic. Mark had racked up a several $1,000 credit card bill on what he called networking expenses. Without a second thought, she asked if I could lend him the money. When I hesitated, she sighed dramatically. "Well, I suppose your father and I will have to dip into our retirement savings. It's just so hard on your father's health." The guilt was a suffocating blanket. I gave Mark the money. He never paid me back, and I spent the first year of my career hunched over our dining room table. Over the years, there had been an endless parade of Mark's emergencies. There was the premium t-shirt line he started that ended with a $50,000 debt, which my parents covered by liquidating some of their stocks. Then there was the time he decided he was a day trader and lost $20,000 of my father's money in a single afternoon. Instead of anger, my father clapped him on the back and said, "That's the price of a real-world education, son." When he wrecked his first sports car, they didn't hesitate to buy him an even nicer one, chiding him gently about being more careful next time. Meanwhile, My accomplishments were met with polite but distracted acknowledgement. When I graduated with honors, they missed the ceremony because Mark had a terrible flu and needed them to make him soup. When my firm landed its first major contract, a library project I had poured my heart into, my father's only comment was, "That's nice. Now you'll be in a better position to help your brother out." That deep-seated inequity became a dull ache inside me, a chronic wound I learned to ignore. I loved them, but I also learned to keep them at arm's length for my own sanity. That was why, 3 years ago, I had funneled every spare dollar from my savings and bonuses into buying a small house on a lake 2 hours outside the city. It wasn't grand, just a simple 2-bedroom cabin with a private dock and a view of the still water. But it was mine. No one had a key but me. It was where I went to escape the pressure of my job, to breathe, and, most importantly, to be free from the financial and emotional weight of my family. The lake house wasn't just property. It was my tangible boundary, a declaration that I had a life entirely separate from their chaos. It was the one place on earth I felt truly safe, a fortress of solitude built not with brick and mortar, but with my own hard work and the desperate need for peace. It was my proof to myself that I could create something beautiful and stable that they couldn't touch. I thought I could endure the favoritism, that I could tolerate being the family ATM as long as I had my escape. I thought I had finally created a space they couldn't touch, a corner of the world that was mine and mine alone. I had no idea they were already holding the tools to tear it all down. The catalyst, as it always was Mark. This time, he'd concocted an idea he proclaimed was disruptive genius, a luxury alpaca wool sock subscription box service. He called it Soul Sanctuary, and with a slick presentation full of buzzwords he'd learned from a podcast, he convinced my parents to invest the very last of their liquid assets, a staggering $100,000, into his venture. He promptly leased a trendy office in a downtown loft, ordered thousands of pairs of socks from a supplier in Peru, and spent a fortune on a glossy marketing campaign featuring Instagram influencers who had never worn a pair of his socks in their lives. For the first few months, the illusion held. My parents were insufferable, talking endlessly about their visionary entrepreneur. "Mark has always had an eye for quality," my father would declare at Sunday dinner. "This company is going to secure our family's legacy." My mother was already fantasizing about Mark's inevitable feature on the cover of Forbes. I was skeptical. One evening, Mark had cornered me, excitedly showing me his business plan on his laptop. It wasn't a plan. It was a glorified mood board. The financial projections were a single slide with a graph that shot up and to the right, with no data to support it. The logistics strategy was a bullet point that simply said, "Efficient global fulfillment." I tried to ask a gentle question. "Mark, this looks great, but have you factored in the cost of customs duties and international shipping?" He had looked at me with a blank stare, then laughed. "That's just details, Emily. You gotta see the big picture." When I gently raised a few of these concerns with my parents, pointing out the cost of customer acquisition, I was immediately shut down. "Oh, Emily," my mother said, with a patronizing wave of her hand. "You're always so pragmatic. You think like an employee. Mark thinks like a CEO. Sometimes you just have to take a leap of faith." Faith, it turned out, couldn't pay the invoices. 6 months in, reality came crashing down. The influencer campaign yielded a pathetic return. The cost of warehousing thousands of unsold high-end socks was bleeding the company dry. Mark had overspent on office furniture, catered lunches, and a custom espresso machine he didn't know how to use. The company was hemorrhaging cash. A palpable panic began to seep into the mansion. The cheerful dinner conversations were replaced by hushed, tense whispers behind closed doors. My father started to look his age. the worry etching deep lines around his eyes. My mother, who prided herself on her composure, became brittle and prone to sudden outbursts of tears. The phone calls to me began. At first, they were subtle hints. "Mark is just hitting a little cash flow problem," my mother would say. "You know how it is with startups. They just need a little boost to get over the hump." Then the calls became more direct. "Emily, your mother and I were talking," my father started one evening, his voice strained with false casualness. "Mark just needs a small bridge loan, a little something to see him through. 50,000 should do it." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Dad, I don't have a spare $50,000 lying around. My money is tied up in long-term investments and my retirement accounts. I can't pull it out without facing massive penalties." "But what about the lake house?" he pressed, his voice losing its casual tone. "It's a valuable asset. You could take out a second mortgage. It's an easy process." A chill went through me. "That house is my security," I said firmly. "It's my emergency fund, and my retirement plan rolled into one. I am not putting it at risk for a failing business." The call ended coldly, but I knew it wasn't over. A few days later, Mark himself called, his voice oozing with a practiced, desperate charm. "Emily, hey! I've got an opportunity for you. A ground floor investment in Soul Sanctuary. I'm telling you, you get in now, and I guarantee you'll double your money in a year." "Mark, I'm not giving you any money," I said, cutting him off. "You need to learn how to manage your own finances." "You're unbelievable," he spat, the charm vanishing instantly. "So selfish. You're sitting pretty in your fancy apartment with your vacation home, and you won't lift a finger to help your own family?" I hung up, my heart pounding. Their desperation was curdling into resentment, and that resentment was aimed squarely at me. I could feel the walls I had built around my life begin to tremble. I knew they were plotting something. I could sense it in the tense silence between their calls. They were cornered, and history had taught me that when they were cornered, I was the one who paid the price. The silence that followed for the next week wasn't peace. It was the quiet before a storm, the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. The storm didn't break with a single thunderclap, but with a series of small, unsettling tremors, each one further eroding my patience and trust. The escalation began with a key. I drove up to the lake house on a crisp October weekend, craving solitude and the calming view of the water. Instead, I found a strange car in my driveway. Inside, I discovered Mark and two of his friends, drinking my beer and watching a football game on my television. The place was a mess. There were wet rings on my reclaimed wood coffee table and potato chip crumbs ground into the rug. The faint smell of stale beer and arrogance hung in the air. "Mark, what are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice tight as a wire. He looked up from the game, completely unabashed. "Hey sis, Mom and Dad gave me the key. Said you wouldn't mind." He winked at his friends. "My sister, the architect, she's got these great places. Total boss." He was using my success as a prop to impress his friends, while simultaneously disrespecting the very symbol of it. White-hot anger flared in my chest. This isn't a frat house, Mark. This is my home, and they had no right to give my key to anyone. "Relax," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "We're just chillin'. It's what family does. We share." I kicked them out and spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning, feeling violated and furious. That evening, I called my parents. "Why did you give Mark a key to my house?" I asked. No preamble. "Oh, Emily, don't be so dramatic," my mother replied, her tone laced with annoyance. "The poor boy is under so much stress. He just needed a place to unwind. You barely even use it." "That is not the point," I seethed, my voice shaking. "The point is respect. The point is a boundary. You crossed it." The conversation went nowhere. They genuinely couldn't see what they'd done wrong. In their minds, my property was an extension of their own, to be used and distributed as they saw fit. The very next week, I drove back up to the lake and had every lock in the house changed. It cost me several $100s, but I considered it an investment in my sanity. The next tremor was a phone call. My mother, her voice syrupy sweet. "Emily, darling, your father and I are meeting with a real estate agent. Just exploring our options, you know." She was asking about your lake house, just for comparison's sake. "Could you remind me of the square footage and the year it was built?" An icy dread washed over me. "Why would you need that information, Mom?" "Just for reference, sweetheart. To get a full picture of the family's assets." "It is not a family asset," I stated, my voice flat. "It is my asset." "Don't be so pedantic, Emily." I refused to give her the details, but the call left me deeply unsettled. They were probing, gathering data. A few days later, I noticed a small charge on my credit card from an online property appraisal service. Someone had used my information. I didn't need to guess who. I called them to confront them. "I don't know what you're talking about," my father lied, his voice a little too loud. "Your card must have been compromised. You should call the bank." They were becoming more brazen in their deceit. The third escalation was pure, unadulterated emotional manipulation. The following Sunday dinner felt like a wake. Mark sat slumped in his chair. My father was stonily silent, and my mother punctuated the quiet with theatrical sighs. Finally, halfway through the meal, she burst into tears. "I just can't bear it," she sobbed, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "To see our family falling apart like this. Mark is about to lose everything he's worked so hard for. And Emily, you just sit there on your pile of assets, refusing to help." "Mom," I've explained. I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't risk." "Risk what?" my father interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Risk a fraction of your comfort to save your brother from ruin? I don't know when we raised such a selfish daughter." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Selfish? I, who had given up my college fund? I, who had loaned them money more times than I could count? I, who had been the responsible one while they enabled Mark's every whim? "I am not selfish," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and hurt. "I am protecting my future, something no one else in this family has ever done for me." I stood up from the table and walked out, unable to stomach another second in that house. As I drove home, angry tears streamed down my face. They had twisted reality, casting me as the villain in their self-made tragedy, all to justify their attempts to take what was mine. A few days later, I met my best friend and colleague, Sarah, for lunch. I poured out the whole sordid story: Mark's home invasion, my mother's appraisal inquiries, the disastrous dinner. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing more and more concerned. When I finished, she put down her fork and looked me straight in the eye. "Emily," she said, her voice firm but kind, "this isn't about money anymore. This is a full-scale assault on your autonomy. They don't respect you as an independent adult. They still see you as a resource, as Mark's safety net." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of validation. "I know, but what do I do? They're my family." "Sometimes," Sarah said gently, "loving your family means setting the hardest boundaries. They are not going to stop until you force them to. Be careful, Em. Desperate people do desperate things." Her words were prophetic. "What do you think they'll do?" I asked, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. She shrugged, her eyes full of concern. "I don't know. But they've shown they're willing to ignore every ethical line to get what they want. You need to be prepared for the worst." I left that lunch feeling profoundly anxious. Sarah was right. I had been too passive, hoping they would come to their senses. They wouldn't. Every time I said no, They just pushed harder, employing tactics that were increasingly aggressive and manipulative. A confrontation was inevitable, and I had a sinking feeling that it was coming much sooner than I thought. They were backing me into a corner, and I needed to figure out how I was going to fight my way out. But even in my worst-case scenarios, I couldn't have imagined the sheer audacity of the betrayal they were about to commit. They weren't just going to cross a line, they were about to obliterate it. The tipping point didn't arrive with a screaming match or a tearful plea. It arrived quietly, officially, and brutally. Inside a manila envelope nestled in my mailbox on a bleak Tuesday afternoon. Inside, among the bills and junk mail, was a letter bearing a lawyer's letterhead. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I tore it open. It was a copy of a legal notice, a notice of title transfer. My eyes scanned the dense legalese, searching for something, anything that made sense. And then I saw it, the address of my lake house, the name of the buyer, a couple I had never heard of, and the names of the sellers, Robert and Carol Thompson, as power of attorney for Emily Thompson. The air was sucked from my lungs. I read it again, and then a third time, but the words refused to change. Sold. They had sold it. I stumbled inside, the floor tilting beneath my feet. How? How could they possibly do this? And then, a faint, terrifying memory surfaced from the recesses of my mind. It was years ago, maybe 7 or 8, right after I'd started my first real job. My father had come to me with a stack of papers. "Emily, these are some estate planning documents," he'd said casually. "Just standard procedure. In case something happens to your mother or me, we need to be able to manage each other's assets. Just sign here, here, and here." I was young, naive, and filled with the daughter's innate trust. He was my father. Of course I signed. I signed without reading the fine print. I signed a durable power of attorney, giving them sweeping authority to act on my behalf in financial matters. I had completely, utterly forgotten about it. Until this exact moment. They had held on to it for all those years, a weapon in waiting. And now, at their moment of peak desperation, they had wielded it. They had used my trust as a key to unlock and liquidate my life. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely dial the number for the real estate agent listed on the notice. A cheerful woman answered. I explained who I was and why I was calling, my voice a strained whisper. "Oh yes, Miss Thompson," she chirped. "That lovely lake house. Your parents are just the sweetest. They explained you were overseas on a long-term project and that they were handling the sale for you so you could invest the money in a new family venture." My own voice felt foreign to me. "Is the sale? Is it finalized?" "Yes, ma'am. We closed last Friday. The funds were wired to the account your father provided." I hung up the phone, a cold numbness spreading through me. It was done. My house was gone. The money was gone, wired directly into the black hole of Mark's alpaca sock fantasy. That was the breaking point. That was the moment of excruciating clarity. All the years of swallowing injustice, the excuses I'd made for their behavior, the sliver of hope that they might one day change it all evaporated in that instant. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a desperate act. This was a calculated, cold-blooded betrayal. They had looked at me, their daughter, and decided that my future, my security, and my sanctuary were expendable, a necessary sacrifice at the altar of my brother's whims. They hadn't just taken a house, they had taken my sense of safety in the world. They had confirmed my deepest, darkest fear, that to them, I was not a daughter to be cherished, but a resource to be exploited. The shock gave way to rage. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, focused fury, a clarity as hard and sharp as a diamond. They had broken something inside me that day, but in doing so, they had also forged something new, an unbreakable resolve. I stood in my living room, the crumpled letter in my fist. The game was over. No more gentle conversations. No more hoping for reason. They had made their move, an act of financial and emotional warfare. And now, it was my turn. As I stood there, phone in hand, the world seemed to fall silent. The shock receded, replaced by a cold, crystalline lucidity. They had declared war. They just didn't know I'd been holding the ultimate weapon all along. My secret weapon wasn't new. It was forged 5 years earlier, in the fires of another crisis, a crisis they had created and thought they had miraculously escaped. To understand, you have to go back. 5 years ago, Mark's first startup, an app he described as Uber for dog walkers, but for the elite, imploded spectacularly. He had not only burned through my parents' savings, but had also convinced my father to take out a massive second mortgage on their mansion for seed funding. When the app failed, the bank came calling. They were on the verge of foreclosure, losing everything. The panic in the house then was even more acute than it was now. My father, a man defined by his pride, was a broken shell. My mother was inconsolable. They came to me, begging for a bailout, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that simply giving them money would be like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. Mark would have another genius idea in 6 months, and the cycle would begin anew. Right around that time, tragedy struck. My maternal grandmother, the only person in the family who had ever truly seen me, passed away, leaving me a substantial inheritance. She was a shrewd, practical woman who had watched her daughter and son-in-law's financial irresponsibility with quiet disapproval for decades. "Use this wisely, Emily," she had written in a letter left for me. "Build your own security before you try to save others from their own choices." Her words were a beacon. I took my inheritance to a trust and estate lawyer, a wise old man named Mr. Davies. I laid out the whole situation. I wanted to help my parents, but I refused to give them a blank check. Mr. Davies proposed a radical solution. "Don't pay off their mortgage," he advised. "Buy it. Buy the house itself." And that is precisely what I did. We established an opaque LLC with a generic name impossible to trace back to me. Through this LLC, with Mr. Davies acting as the intermediary, I bought the mansion from the bank just before it was scheduled for auction. To my parents, it appeared as though an anonymous investor had purchased the property and, in an act of unbelievable benevolence, had agreed to let them continue living there rent-free, provided they handled the upkeep. They celebrated their miraculous good fortune. They never questioned it. Their pride wouldn't allow them to imagine that their savior was the daughter they consistently undervalued. For 5 years, I had paid the property taxes on that house. I had kept a roof over their heads, all in secret. It was my ultimate safety net, not for them, but for me. It was my ace in the hole, a card I prayed I would never have to play. Now, they had forced my hand. Immediately after hanging up with the real estate agent, I called Mr. Davies. I told him everything, the sale of the lake house, the forgotten power of attorney. He listened silently, only interjecting with a clarifying question here and there. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Emily," he said finally, his voice simmering with controlled indignation. "This is flagrant fraud. Using an old, potentially deceptively obtained power of attorney to liquidate a major asset for their own benefit is deeply illegal. We can and we will pursue this." "I know," I said, my voice now steady and firm. "But before we do that, I need to confront them. I need to end this, once and for all, on my own terms." "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "They took my house," I said simply. "Now I'm taking mine back, the one they're living in." Mr. Davies understood instantly. We spent the next hour mapping out the strategy. Step 1. He would prepare all the necessary documentation, a notarized copy of the mansion's title in the name of my LLC, the LLC's formation documents, and a formal notice to quit, which was, for all intents and purposes, an eviction notice. Step 2. Mr. Davies would also contact the bank and the title company to put an immediate freeze on the funds from the lake house sale, citing fraud. It would be a legal battle, but we could at least stop them from spending the money on alpaca socks. Step 3. The most critical part. The showdown. I would call a family meeting at the mansion, under the guise of discussing a financial solution for Mark. Mr. Davies would accompany me, posing as my financial advisor. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Emily?" Mr. Davies asked gently before we hung up. "There's no going back from this." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," I replied. After the call, I sat in silence, feeling the weight of my decision. This was the end of my family as I knew it, but perhaps it was also the beginning of my life as it was meant to be. I had spent too many years trying to please them, seeking an approval that never came. I had played the part of the dutiful, responsible daughter while they took it for granted. No more. They had broken the unspoken contract of a family. They had shown that their loyalty was only to Mark and their own delusions. Now, my only loyalty was to myself, to my future, and to the memory of the grandmother who taught me to protect it. The plan was set. The pieces were in place. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of real estate and finance? Fine. It was time to show them who really owned the board. I timed the call perfectly. Friday morning, giving them the whole day to bask in their perceived victory. I kept my voice calm, even a little defeated, when I spoke to my mother. "Mom," I said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I think I've figured out a way to help Mark. Can we all meet tonight at the house to discuss some ideas? I'm bringing my financial advisor." A triumphant silence hung on the line for a beat too long. "Oh, Emily, I knew you'd come around," she gushed, relief and smugness dripping from her voice. "Of course, darling. 8 o'clock?" At precisely 8, Mr. Davies and I pulled into the familiar driveway of the mansion. The house was blazing with lights, and I could see the silhouettes of 3 figures in the grand living room window. They were waiting, no doubt feeling righteous in their treachery. My heart hammered against my ribs. But as I stepped out of the car, a strange, cold calm settled over me. This wasn't their house. This was my house. My father opened the door, a wide, disingenuous smile plastered on his face. "Emily, come in, come in! And this must be Mr. Davies," my lawyer said, extending a firm hand. "Emily's financial advisor." "Excellent, excellent. We're so glad you've finally seen reason," my father said, patting my shoulder condescendingly. We walked into the living room. My mother and Mark were arranged on the plush white leather sofas like royalty holding court. Mark looked relieved, his usual smirk firmly back in place. My mother was radiant. "Emily, sit down, dear," she said, gesturing to an armchair. "I've made some coffee. We're just so eager to hear your plan." Mr. Davies and I took our seats opposite them. I placed my leather briefcase on the coffee table with a soft thud. "Before we begin," I said, my voice even, "I want you to know that I am aware of the sale of the lake house." The smugness on their faces faltered, just for a second. "It was something we had to do, Emily," my father said, adopting a somber tone. "A difficult decision, but it was for the good of the family." "For the good of Mark," I corrected gently. "It's one and the same," my mother chirped. "When one member of the family succeeds, we all succeed." I looked at them then, truly looked at them, perhaps for the first time. 3 deeply self-centered people living in a fantasy world where their actions never had consequences. "I see," I said. And since I am such a firm believer in investing in family assets, I've decided to make a much, much larger investment. Mark leaned forward, his eyes lighting up with greed. A larger investment? In my company? No, I said, snapping open my briefcase. In real estate. I pulled out the first file and slid it across the table. It was the title to the mansion. My father picked it up, putting on his reading glasses. He frowned. What is this? Thompson Holdings, LLC? Is this some kind of joke? Not at all, Mr. Davies interjected, his voice firm and authoritative. That is the legal title for this property, as recorded at the county registrar's office. Thompson Holdings, LLC, is the sole legal owner of this house and the land upon which it sits. But that's impossible, my mother stammered, her hand flying to her throat. This is our house. We've lived here for 20 years. Not for the last 5, I said, my voice cold and precise. 5 years ago, when Mark's last failed startup had you on the brink of foreclosure, Grandma left me an inheritance. I used that money to create Thompson Holdings, and that company bought this house from the bank. I have let you live here, rent-free, for 5 years. A heavy, stunned silence descended upon the room. You could practically see the gears grinding in their heads as they struggled to process this impossible information. The color drained from my father's face, leaving it a pasty gray. Mark's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer horror. My mother just stared at me, her mouth agape. You're lying, she whispered. Mr. Davies has all the documentation right here, I said, nodding towards him. Bank transfers, incorporation papers, the purchase agreement. It's all very real. My father dropped the title on the table as if it were on fire. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see arrogance or condescension. I saw fear, raw, primal fear. Why? Why would you do that? He asked, his voice a hoarse croak. Because I knew if I just gave you the money, you would give it to Mark, and the cycle would repeat, I explained. I wanted to make sure you had a roof over your heads. I thought it was an act of kindness. I thought that's what families do for each other, protect each other. But I was wrong. I rose to my feet, a surge of power flowing through my veins. Families don't defraud each other. Families don't steal from each other. Families don't sacrifice one child's future for another child's failures. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out the second file, and placed it on top of the title. What's that? Mark asked, his voice trembling. That, I said, looking my father dead in the eye, is a 30-day notice to quit. You sold my house. So now, I'm taking my house back. You have 1 month to gather your belongings and find another place to live. My mother let out a choked sob. Emily, no, you can't do this to us. I can, and I am, I said. Actions have consequences. These are yours. I turned to Mark. And as for you, the funds from the lake house sale have been frozen. Mr. Davies will be filing a suit for fraud and illegal use of a power of attorney on my behalf. You won't see a single cent. As I walked out of that living room, leaving them sitting in the rubble of their own greed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the family I wished I had, and a quiet, steely resolve to build the life I deserved. I didn't look back. I walked out the front door of the house I owned, into the cool night air, and never glanced over my shoulder. Mr. Davies followed a few paces behind, his silence a comforting, solid presence. We didn't speak on the drive back. There was nothing left to say. Everything had been said in the stunned, cavernous silence of that room. That night, I stayed at Sarah's. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and didn't ask a single question. She just pulled me into a fierce hug, then made me a cup of tea and let me sit quietly on her sofa. staring out at the city lights. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of the secret, of the impending confrontation, had been lifted. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal calls and life logistics. True to his word, Mr. Davies had the funds from the lake house sale successfully frozen. The title company, presented with evidence of the fraud, was immediately cooperative. There would be a process to get the money back, but it was safe from Mark's grasp. My parents tried to call. My phone buzzed incessantly with their numbers. They left a series of voicemails that ran the gamut of emotions. Tearful, angry, pleading. "How could you do this to your own mother and father?" my mother cried in one message. "After everything we've done for you," my father roared in another. "You've destroyed this family," Mark screamed in a third. I didn't answer. I blocked their numbers. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. There was nothing they could say that would change what had happened. The conversation was over. It was time for consequences. With Sarah's help, I started looking for a new place to live. I decided against trying to buy back the lake house. It was tainted by the betrayal. Instead, I wanted a fresh start, something that was entirely mine. I found a stunning loft in a converted factory downtown, with exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a private rooftop terrace with a skyline view. It was the antithesis of the lake house, urban, energetic, and full of life. It was exactly what I needed. I used a portion of my savings for the down payment and began the process of moving in. The act of filling that empty space with my things, hanging my art on the walls, and arranging my books on the shelves was therapeutic. Each object was an affirmation of my identity, separate from them. Meanwhile, news of my family's situation trickled back to me through my Aunt Susan, my father's sister, who had always been my quiet ally. The eviction was proceeding. My parents were in a state of panic, scrambling to find a place to go. They were discovering that their lavish lifestyle was impossible to maintain on my father's meager retirement income. They had no savings. Mark had burned through it all long ago. They had to sell their luxury cars. They had to cancel their country club memberships. The reality of their financial situation, a reality I had shielded them from for years, was finally laid bare. They found a small rental apartment in a much less glamorous part of town. Mark, with the bank of Mom and Dad officially closed, had to abandon his trendy office. The soul sanctuary was no more. For the first time in his life, according to Aunt Susan, Mark was looking for a real job. For me, being free from the financial responsibility for them was like shedding a heavy cloak I didn't even realize I was wearing. I no longer had to brace myself for the next call asking for a bailout. I no longer had to feel a pang of guilt for spending money on myself. I was free. I felt the profound relief of watching them finally have to live with the consequences of their actions, with no one to rescue them. And I was learning to live with the quiet, a quiet that was at first unsettling, but was slowly, surely, turning into peace. 1 year can change everything. Standing on my rooftop terrace, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in hues of gold and rose, I was almost unrecognizable from the panicked, betrayed woman I had been 12 months prior. My life had bloomed in ways I never thought possible. My architecture firm had its most successful year on record. Freed from the emotional drain of my family, my creativity had been unleashed. We won a prestigious contract to design a new contemporary art gallery, a dream project that put my firm on the map. I hired 2 more junior architects, and our studio buzzed with an energy of collaboration and innovation that was intoxicating. I found joy in my work again, a joy I hadn't realized had been slowly dimming for years. My loft became my true sanctuary. It wasn't silent like the lake house, but it was filled with the sounds of life. Sarah and other friends were frequent guests for dinner parties. I hosted book club meetings, joined a pottery class, and started watercolor painting on weekends. I was building a community, a chosen family based on mutual respect and support. Legally, everything was resolved. With the evidence stacked against them, my parents had no choice but to cooperate. The money from the lake house sale was returned to me in full. Mr. Davies had urged me to press charges for fraud, but in the end, I chose not to. Reclaiming my house and my money was justice enough. Subjecting my elderly parents to a criminal battle felt like a cruelty I didn't need. Their downfall was its own sentence. Their fate was a cautionary tale of pride and entitlement. Aunt Susan still gave me infrequent updates. They were struggling. Their small rental apartment was a constant, stark reminder of all they had lost. My father, a man who had built his identity on status, now rarely left the house. His health had declined, the stress of losing everything taking a visible toll. It was my mother who tried to build a bridge. About 6 months after the showdown, she began sending tentative emails. At first, they were filled with self-pity, but slowly, the tone began to shift. She started to acknowledge their mistakes, their blatant favoritism of Mark, the way they had taken me for granted. I spent my whole life believing my job was to make Mark happy, she wrote in one email. I didn't realize that in doing so, I was making you so profoundly unhappy. I am sorry, Emily, for all of it. It was the apology I had waited my entire life to hear. It didn't erase the pain, but it opened a small door. We started meeting for coffee once a month at a neutral cafe halfway between our homes. Our conversations were stilted and awkward, but they were honest. I set firm boundaries. We did not discuss money. I did not offer solutions. I just listened. It was a beginning, a new relationship being built from the ashes of the old. I wasn't sure if it would ever be warm, but at least it was real. Mark was another story. He was served a harsh dose of reality. After bouncing between a few retail jobs, he had to move to another state for a position in sales. He was paying his own rent for the first time at age 32. According to my mother, he was growing up, but he still had a long way to go. He never reached out to me. Maybe one day he will, but I am not holding my breath. The biggest surprise came from what I did with the mansion. After they moved out, I didn't know what to do with it. The house held too many painful memories to sell or live in. But then, an idea took hold. I reached out to a local nonprofit that provides transitional housing for women and children escaping domestic abuse. Today, the Thompson House, as it's now known, is a safe haven. The sprawling bedrooms that once housed arrogance now house healing families. The manicured garden where my mother held lavish tea parties is now a safe playground for children. I used that asset, the ultimate symbol of their control, and turned it into a symbol of freedom and hope for others. I still pay the property taxes, and a small foundation I established with my firm's profits covers the upkeep. It is the house's true legacy. As I sipped my wine on my terrace, I realized I hadn't lost a house last year. I had been liberated from a prison. The lake house was just a building, but it represented my independence. Losing it, ironically, forced me to claim the power I'd held all along. Sometimes, you have to tear down the old foundation to build something stronger, something true. Looking back, I now see that my parents' ultimate act of betrayal, as agonizing as it was also the greatest gift they ever gave me. It shattered the illusion I had clung to for a lifetime and forced me to confront a fundamental truth. You cannot earn respect from people who are unwilling to give it. You cannot fix deeply ingrained patterns by simply being more dutiful, more successful, or more accommodating. I spent years of my life building walls, both literally as an architect and emotionally in my personal life. But I was mistaken to think that a lake house, a physical boundary, could protect me from a dysfunction that was rooted in the very foundation of my family. True protection doesn't come from external walls. It comes from the internal boundaries we set for ourselves. the unwavering belief in our own worth. This journey has taught me that real family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by the people who champion your dreams, celebrate your successes, and, most importantly, respect your no. Real family would never sell your sanctuary to fund someone else's fantasy. Reclaiming ownership of the mansion wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of self-preservation. It was me finally declaring that my value was non-negotiable and my security was not up for sacrifice. Transforming that house into a shelter for others was my way of rewriting its story, changing its legacy from one of control and entitlement to one of healing and hope. It was the ultimate act of turning a negative into a profound positive. Today, I live a life unburdened by their approval, unweighted by responsibilities that were never mine to carry. I am free. And that freedom is more valuable than any house or any bank account. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with your family to protect your own future? What did you learn from that experience? Share your stories in the comments below. I would love to read them. And if this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your support helps me continue to share these important life lessons. Remember, your peace and your dreams are worth protecting, even if it means redesigning your entire life. Thank you for listening.